Welcome to Why Food Sucked in Medieval Times. I'm your host, and today we're kicking off our deep dive into one of history's most overlooked topics: what people actually ate during the Middle Ages. Now, if you've ever seen a movie or read a book about knights, castles, or peasants, you might think medieval life was all banquets, roasted boars, and goblets of wine. But here's the truth. For most people, medieval food wasn't exactly Michelin star dining. In fact, it kind of sucked. Before we dig into the porridge and pickled fish, let's get some context. We're talking about the Middle Ages, roughly from the 5th to the late 15th century. That's over 1,000 years of history across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Africa. This was a time before refrigerators, supermarkets, or even forks. People lived close to the land, which meant their food choices were limited by geography, climate, and class. And trust me, if you were born poor, your diet was about survival, not flavor. One of the biggest differences in medieval food? Class. If you were rich, say, a noble or a king, your table was full of meat, spices, wine, and fancy pastries. You dined in grand halls, with musicians playing while you stuffed your face. But if you were a peasant, which most people were, your daily meal looked more like this: bread, porridge, and maybe a few onions or cabbage if you were lucky. And guess what? That was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Every day, for years. Let's start with bread, the cornerstone of every medieval diet. Depending on where you lived and how rich you were, your bread could be soft and white, if you were wealthy, or coarse, dark, and filled with bits of stone ground in, if you were poor. And here's a fun fact. Because flour was often ground using stones, tiny bits of grit would mix in, wearing down people's teeth over time. So yes, eating bread literally wore out your teeth. Ouch! If you weren't eating bread, you were probably eating pottage, a thick soup made from whatever grains, vegetables, or scraps you had lying around. Think of it as the medieval version of instant noodles, except there was no flavor packet and it never tasted the same twice. Sometimes pottage was just water, barley, and a few weeds. Other times, if someone got lucky hunting or fishing, it might have a bit of meat, but mostly it was hot mush. Meanwhile, up in the castle, nobles were living their best lives. They feasted on roasted meats, spiced sauces, sugared almonds, and sweet wines imported from faraway lands. Banquets were extravagant events with jugglers, music, and dishes so over the top they were basically medieval Instagram bait. And those spices, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, they weren't just for flavor, they were symbols of wealth. Some spices were worth their weight in gold. Nobles showed off their riches by dumping them into every dish. Of course, none of this food came with an expiration date. Without refrigeration, preservation was key, and that's where salt became your best friend. Meat was dried, smoked, or packed in salt to keep it from rotting. In fact, salt was so valuable that armies marched across continents to control salt mines, and sailors were paid in salt, which is where the word salary comes from. And then there was seasonality. Unlike today, where you can buy strawberries in January and mangoes in March, medieval people only ate what was available at that time of year. In winter, fresh food was almost impossible to find. Root vegetables like turnips and onions were dug up from storage. Bread and porridge were the mainstays, and if you were really desperate, you might eat tree bark. Medieval food wasn't just bland, it could also kill you. Without proper sanitation or understanding of germs, foodborne illness was common. And thanks to mouldy bread, many people suffered from something called ergot poisoning, which caused hallucinations, convulsions, and even death. So yeah, medieval food wasn't just boring, it was dangerous. Before we dive into the nitty-gritty of peasant diets, let's talk about who peasants were. These were the farmers, shepherds, blacksmiths, and labourers making up around 90% of the population. They worked from dawn till dusk just to survive. Their lives revolved around seasons, harvests, and survival. And their food? Well, that was all about staying alive, not enjoying a meal. Let's start with the foundation of every peasant meal: bread. If you lived in medieval Europe and weren't rich, bread was basically your entire life. It was breakfast, lunch, dinner, and sometimes even dessert, if you could call it that. Depending on where you lived and how poor you were, your bread could be coarse and dark, made from rye or barley, or if you were slightly better off, maybe some wheat. But no matter what kind of bread you had, one thing was certain: it was rough on your teeth, because flour was often ground using stone mills. Tiny bits of grit would mix in. Over time, this literally wore down people's teeth. Imagine chewing bread that slowly grinds away at your molars. Not fun. If you weren't eating bread, you were probably eating pottage, the medieval version of oatmeal, soup, and mashed potatoes all rolled into one. Pottage was basically whatever you could throw into a pot and cook until it turned into hot mush. Sometimes pottage was just water, barley, and a few weeds. Other times, if someone got lucky hunting or fishing, it might have a bit of meat. But mostly, it was hot, bland, and filling just enough to keep you alive. And guess what? You ate this stuff every single day. No variety, no spice, just pottage, day after day, year after year. Of course, in the winter months, things got even worse. Fresh vegetables were gone. Meat was scarce unless you'd salted or smoked it during warmer months. So, you were left with what you had stored, usually dried grains, onions, and maybe a bit of salted pork if you were lucky. Imagine trying to survive on nothing but bread and porridge for weeks at a time. That's what most peasants did. And if the harvest failed that year, starvation wasn't just a possibility, it was a reality. And let's not forget about mold. Without proper storage, food spoiled quickly, especially in damp homes without central heating. Bread would go stale within hours. Vegetables rotted. cheese grew fuzzy. But guess what? People still ate it anyway, because starving was worse than eating something gross. And sometimes, moldy bread contained a fungus called ergot, which could cause hallucinations, convulsions, and even death. So yeah, medieval food wasn't just boring, it could also kill you. Meanwhile, up in the castle, nobles were feasting on roasted meats, sweet wines, and spiced sauces imported from faraway lands. They had fresh fruits in season, sugared almonds for snacks, and even early forms of ice cream made with snow and milk. While peasants were scraping mold off their bread, nobles were throwing extravagant banquets with music, dancing, and dishes so fancy they were basically medieval Instagram bait. Class made all the difference, and for peasants, it meant a lifetime of repetition, scarcity, and survival. Medieval nobles were the upper crust landowners, knights, lords, and royalty. They made up only about 5–10% of the population, but they controlled nearly everything. And when it came to food, they didn't eat to survive, they ate to impress. Every meal was a performance, a way to show off their wealth, taste, and social standing. If you were invited to a noble banquet, you weren't just getting dinner, you were getting an experience. These feasts could last for hours, even days. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted boars, whole peacocks served with their feathers still on, and pies filled with live birds that flew out when you cut them open. Yes, that really happened. And no, they didn't do it for flavor, they did it for entertainment. So what did nobles actually eat? For starters, meat, lots of it. Beef, pork, venison, game birds, and sometimes even exotic animals like swans or peacocks. They also had access to fresh fruits in season, dairy products, eggs, and imported cheeses. But the real luxury? The spices. Spices were the ultimate status symbol. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg travelled thousands of miles from Asia to Europe, making them incredibly rare and expensive. Some spices were literally worth their weight in gold. Nobles used them not just for flavour, but to prove they could afford them. Imagine seasoning your chicken with something so valuable that if you spilled it, you'd cry. Sugar was another rare treat. It wasn't cheap, and it certainly wasn't everyday food. Back then, sugar was considered a medicine, not a dessert ingredient. Only the wealthiest nobles could afford it regularly. When they did, they used it to make fancy sweets like marzipan, candied fruits, and spiced wine. Drinks were another way to show off. Nobles drank fine wines imported from France and Italy. Some even added spices to their wine to make it extra fancy. Beer and ale were common too, especially during meals. Unlike today, medieval beer was often weak and watery, but still safer to drink than water. Now let's compare this feast to what peasants were eating. While nobles were sipping spiced wine and gnawing on roasted deer legs, peasants were scraping mould off stale bread and stirring lukewarm pottage. The gap between rich and poor wasn't just big, it was massive. One class ate to live, the other ate to flex. Before we jump into the methods, let's talk about the problem. Medieval food rotted fast. Without modern storage, anything left out too long became a science experiment. And if you didn't preserve your food, you starved. So people got creative, and by creative, I mean they soaked everything in salt or packed it in vinegar. The most powerful tool in the medieval kitchen, salt. Not just for flavor, salt was survival. People used it to preserve meat, fish, and even butter. Rub it in, pack it in barrels, and leave it to dry. This turned food rock hard and super salty, but at least it wouldn't kill you. In fact, salt was so valuable that armies went to war over salt mines. Sailors were paid in salt, which is where the word salary comes from. Smoking wasn't just for flavor, it was a way to make meat last through winter. Meat was hung in smoky huts for days, sometimes weeks. The smoke dried it out and killed bacteria, but it also made everything taste like campfire. And not the fun kind, the I'm just happy, it doesn't kill me kind. Drying food was simple. Hang it in the sun or near a fire until all the moisture was gone. No water equals no rot. Beef became jerky, fish became cod sticks, fruits became raisins and prunes, which might sound normal until you realize they were often infested with bugs. But hey, protein is protein. Pickling was another way to keep food edible. Vegetables, eggs, even fish, throw them in vinegar or brine and wait. Fermentation was even wilder. Some foods were left to sit in barrels until they bubbled and changed flavor, like sauerkraut, yogurt, and beer. Yes, beer counted as preserved food, and honestly, it probably helped deal with everything else they had to eat. Now let's compare this to today. We have fridges, freezers, vacuum sealers, and even expiration dates. Back then, if it smelled okay, looked okay, and didn't move when you poked it, you ate it. We've come a long way, and thank goodness for that. Let's start with salt. Not just for seasoning, but for survival. Without refrigeration, salt was your only way to keep meat from rotting. Salt was so valuable that Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in it, which is where the word salary comes from. And in some places, salt was traded ounce for gold. Literally. You could buy a horse with a sack of salt, and people did. Next up, pepper, also known as black gold. This wasn't just flavoring, it was status. Pepper came all the way from India, carried by caravans and ships across continents. By the time it reached Europe, it cost a fortune. Nobles didn't use pepper to season food, they used it to prove they could afford it. If you had pepper on your table, you were rich. End of story. Then there's cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. the holy trinity of medieval luxury. These spices traveled thousands of miles from Southeast Asia to Europe. Along the way, they passed through dozens of hands and got marked up again and again. By the time nutmeg hit a nobleman's plate, it was worth more than silver. And guess what? People believed nutmeg could cure the plague. Now let's talk about the most expensive spice of them all. Saffron, also known as liquid gold. Saffron comes from the delicate stigmas of crocus flowers, and harvesting it takes thousands of blossoms for just a pinch of spice. It was used to color food, make medicine, and even dye fabric. Only the richest nobles could afford it, and when they did, they flaunted it. The demand for spices changed the course of history. Wars were fought over spice islands. Ships were built just to carry pepper. Venice became one of the richest cities in Europe by controlling spice imports. Later, Portugal and Spain launched global voyages, all for cinnamon and cloves. So yes, spices didn't just flavor food. They fueled exploration, empire building, and even conflict. Now, let's get real. Did these spices actually taste good, or were they just for show? Some spices were used to mask bad smells like old meat that had been sitting around too long. Others were added purely for status. But not all spice use was fake. Some recipes genuinely used spices to enhance flavor, especially in sweet dishes and wines. Famines weren't rare in the Middle Ages, they were common, and they had many causes. A single bad harvest could doom thousands. Too much rain meant floods ruined crops. Too little rain meant droughts dried them out. War was another killer. Invading armies burned farms, stole grain, and left peasants with nothing. And then there was the weather. Yes, medieval Europe went through a mini ice age that made farming harder than ever. When famine struck, who suffered first? The poor, of course. Nobles stored grain, bought imports, and hoarded food. But peasants? They lived off what they grew, and if that failed, they were doomed. Some nobles even raised prices during famine, making the poor pay more for less. Brutal. Starvation didn't just make you hungry, it made you sick. Without enough calories, bodies slowed down, people got weaker, their skin turned pale, and hair fell out. Children stopped growing, adults lost muscle. Some developed swollen bellies from malnutrition, and if it went long enough, death followed. When food ran out, people got creative. Very, very creative. They ate weeds, tree bark, grasses, and roots dug up from the forest. Some boiled old leather shoes to make soup. Others ate rats, dogs, or horses. If you were lucky, you found moldy bread or spoiled porridge. If not, you turned to darker options. Yes, we're going there. During the worst famines, people turned to cannibalism. Historical records from France, Russia, and even Ireland tell chilling stories of parents eating children, villagers killing strangers for meat, and corpses vanishing from graves. Was it widespread? Probably not, but it was real and feared by everyone. Famine didn't just kill people, it broke society. Hunger led to crime. Theft became normal. Villages turned violent. Even religious rules were broken. In some places, mobs attacked nobles demanding food. In others, people fled cities to search for scraps. Famine wasn't just about food, it was about survival, fear, and collapse. First off, water was dangerous, really dangerous. Cities and villages didn't have clean water systems. Waste was dumped into rivers. Animals roamed the streets, garbage piled up everywhere. So if you took a drink from a stream or, well, you might also be drinking poop. That's right. Water was often so dirty that people avoided it like the plague, literally. Instead of water, everyone drank ale or beer, including children. Medieval beer was weak, watery, and brewed daily. It was safer than water and gave a little energy boost. Farmers drank it with breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Monks had special brewing rights. Some monks even got 10 pints per day. Yes, 10 pints, every single day. If you were rich, you skipped the ale and went straight for the wine. Wine was imported from France and Italy, expensive and fancy. Nobles drank it at every meal, sometimes spiced with pepper or cinnamon. And unlike today, wine was sweet, cloudy, and often mixed with honey or herbs. Still better than moldy bread. Not everyone drank beer or wine. Some regions preferred mead, a sweet fermented drink made from honey. Others drank cider, especially in England and Normandy. And monks loved their herbal brews, some of which became early forms of liqueur. In short, medieval people drank a lot, but rarely water. Some drinks weren't just for fun. They were medicine. Spiced wines were common during cold months. Recipes called for cloves, ginger, and even garlic. Mead was believed to cure everything from coughs to infertility. Herbal beers were brewed by monks for healing. So yes, medieval people basically lived on alcohol and claimed it kept them healthy. Drinking wasn't just about survival, it was about culture. Feasts lasted for days. Weddings served endless rounds of ale. Religious holidays included drinking rituals. Even churches held drunken festivals where priests let loose and partied hard. Alcohol was more than a drink, it was part of life. Let's start with one of the biggest problems: lack of fresh food. Most people ate bread, porridge, and whatever they could store through winter. That meant no citrus, no leafy greens, and no fresh fruit for months at a time. And guess what happens when you don't get enough vitamin C? Scurvy hits, swollen gums, loose teeth, bruising, bleeding, death. Yes, scurvy wasn't just a sailor's disease, it hit peasants too. Now let's talk about something even scarier: moldy bread. Without proper storage, bread often went stale and grew fuzzy. But people still ate it anyway because starving was worse than eating mold. But sometimes that mold was ergot fungus, a killer that caused seizures, madness, and death. Historians believe ergot poisoning may have caused mass hallucinations, even inspiring witch trials. Beyond mold, medieval food came with another problem: sanitation. Kitchens were dirty, water was contaminated, meat rotted quickly. People didn't wash their hands or anything else, really. So food poisoning was common. Parasites like worms were everywhere. Dysentery spread fast. In short, if your food didn't kill you slowly, it might kill you fast. Of course, not everyone got sick equally. Once again, class made all the difference. Nobles had better access to fresh meat, imported fruits, and spices with antibacterial properties. Peasants? They lived off bread, mouldy porridge, and whatever scraps they could find. That's why peasants lost teeth faster, got sick more often, and died younger. Poor diet didn't just cause slow decline, it made people more vulnerable to disease. During the Black Death, those already weakened by hunger were the first to die. Malnourished bodies couldn't fight infection. Starvation made pandemics even deadlier. Poor diet didn't just cause slow decline, it made people more vulnerable to disease. During the Black Death, those already weakened by hunger were the first to die. Malnourished bodies couldn't fight infection. Starvation made pandemics even deadlier. To understand medieval diets, you have to understand one thing. The church ran everything. From birth to death, the church told people how to live, including what they could put in their mouths. And if you broke the rules, you weren't just breaking a diet, you were committing a sin. One of the biggest rules, no meat on Fridays or during Lent or before major holidays like Christmas. Meat was associated with indulgence, so the church said nope, especially during holy periods. Dairy, eggs, and sometimes even butter were also off limits at times. Yes, even butter. So what did people eat instead of meat? Fish. The church said fish was okay so suddenly, every Friday turned into fish day. Some people took advantage of this rule. Fishermen got rich selling fish, and nobles dined on exotic seafood like eel and sturgeon. Yes, some nobles found ways to feast while pretending they were fasting. So what did people eat instead of meat? Fish. The church said fish was okay so suddenly, every Friday turned into fish day. Some people took advantage of this rule. Fishermen got rich selling fish, and nobles dined on exotic seafood like eel and sturgeon. Yes, some nobles found ways to feast while pretending they were fasting. Of course, the church didn't just tell people to starve, they also threw massive feasts. After fasting came festivals. Christmas, Easter, and Saints' Days were excuses to eat everything in sight: roasted meats, sweet wines, and spiced dishes. Talk about emotional whiplash. Go from weeks of hunger to a week of gluttony. Now here's the twist. Not everyone fasted equally. Peasants had no choice. They barely had meat anyway. Nobles? They found loopholes. If your local priest gave you permission and you paid enough, you could skip the fast entirely. Or just eat fancy fish and call it a day. First off, no ovens, not for most people anyway. If you were rich, maybe you had a stone oven in your castle. But if you were poor, you cooked over an open flame like camping? except you did it every day. And yes, some people accidentally set their houses on fire doing it. The main way people cooked was over an open fire, usually in the center of the room. They used tripods or hooks to hang pots above the flames. They stirred porridge, soups, and stews until their arms hurt. And because there were no chimneys in many homes, smoke filled the air constantly. So yeah, medieval eyes always watered. Now let's talk about roasting, the nobleman's favorite cooking method. At banquets, whole animals were roasted on spits, long metal rods turned by hand or by foot-powered gears. It took hours. It made everything taste smoky. And sometimes the person turning the spit fell asleep and dropped the whole thing. Yes, that really happened. For peasants, boiling was the go-to method. One big pot, one fire, endless pottage. You threw in whatever you had, grains, roots, maybe a bit of meat if you were lucky, and let it simmer all day. Some families used the same pot for weeks, adding new ingredients as they went. That's not slow cooking, that's slow rotting. Bread wasn't baked in ovens unless you lived in a town with a communal one. Most peasants cooked bread using fire, heated stones, or under a clay dome covered in embers. It worked, kind of. Sometimes it tasted okay, other times it was just charcoal with hopes. Beyond solid food, fermentation was huge. Beer was brewed daily. Wine was aged in barrels. Vegetables were pickled in vinegar or brine. Mead fermented honey was a favorite drink. And sauerkraut-like foods were common before refrigeration existed. So even though they couldn't microwave leftovers, medieval cooks knew how to make things last. So there you have it. Medieval cooking wasn't just messy, it was dangerous, time-consuming, and sometimes explosive. Next time, we're diving into something totally different. Regional differences. Europe compared. Because guess what? What you ate depended entirely on where you lived. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, or you might miss out on the next episode of Why Food Sucked in Medieval Times.